When people imagine France, nuclear reactors probably aren't the first thing that comes to mind. You think of Paris, cafes, vineyards, luxury fashion, high-speed trains, and maybe someone carrying a baguette down a narrow street. But travel outside the famous cities, and another version of France begins to appear. Along rivers and across the countryside stand enormous cooling towers, power stations and transmission lines. They are part of an energy system that makes France very unusual. Because while much of Europe built its electricity system around coal, natural gas, and more recently, rapidly expanding renewables, France made a massive bet on the atom. And that decision helps explain modern France surprisingly well. Today, EDF operates 57 nuclear reactors at 19 sites in France, with around 62.9 gigawatts of installed nuclear capacity. In 2025, nuclear plants produced about 373 terawatt-hours of electricity, representing roughly 68% of total French electricity generation. That's an extraordinary number. In many countries, nuclear power is one ingredient in the electricity mix. In France, it has spent decades being the backbone of the entire system. To understand why, you have to go back to the 1970s. France had a problem. Its modern economy needed enormous quantities of energy, but the country had relatively limited domestic energy resources. Then came the oil shock of 1973, when global oil prices surged and suddenly dependence on imported fuel looked much more dangerous. France's response wasn't subtle. In 1974, the government decided to dramatically accelerate nuclear construction. The program became associated with Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer and is often called the Mesmer Plan. Instead of slowly adding a few reactors, France began building them on an industrial scale. The basic thinking was simple. If France couldn't control the world's oil fields, it could at least control more of the infrastructure producing its electricity. And France approached nuclear power in a very French way: centralized, standardized, and driven heavily by the state. Rather than constructing dozens of completely different reactor designs, the country built fleets of similar pressurized water reactors. EDF developed enormous technical experience operating them, while an entire French nuclear industry grew around engineering, fuel processing, maintenance, and reactor technology. By the 1980s and 1990s, nuclear plants were becoming one of the defining pieces of French infrastructure. The country had essentially transformed an international energy crisis into one of the world's largest nuclear power programs. The International Energy Agency notes that France's exceptionally low-carbon electricity system today is largely a result of the nuclear fleet constructed during those decades. And here's where the story gets interesting. A nuclear plant looks incredibly complicated, but the basic idea is surprisingly familiar. At its heart, it's basically an extremely sophisticated way of boiling water. Inside the reactor, atoms of uranium undergo nuclear fission. That process releases heat. The heat ultimately produces steam. The steam turns a turbine, and the turbine drives a generator that produces electricity. The giant cooling towers people associate with nuclear plants aren't producing electricity themselves. They're part of the cooling system dealing with enormous quantities of heat. What makes nuclear different from a coal or gas plant is where that heat comes from. Instead of continuously burning huge quantities of fossil fuel, it comes from nuclear reactions inside a comparatively small amount of fuel. For France, this created another major advantage. Carbon emissions from electricity generation stayed remarkably low compared with many other large industrial economies. In 2025, nuclear power and renewable energy together produced 521.1 terawatt-hours, or about 95.2% of mainland France's electricity generation. RTE reported the greenhouse gas intensity of French electricity generation at only about 19.6 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt-hour that year. That means something as ordinary as charging an electric car, running a washing machine, or powering a factory in France can be connected to an electricity system with very little fossil fuel generation. But there's another consequence most visitors never notice. France often produces enough electricity not only for itself, but also to sell huge quantities to neighboring countries. Electricity flows across France's borders through interconnected European grids. In 2025, France recorded a net electricity export balance of 92.3 terawatt-hours, according to RTE. So those reactors beside French rivers aren't simply powering Parisian apartments. At different moments, French electricity can also flow toward Britain, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, and Spain. But nuclear power hasn't made France invincible. In fact, 2022 revealed one of the biggest weaknesses of building so much of your electricity system around one technology. A number of French reactors had to undergo inspections and repairs after stress corrosion cracking was discovered in parts of the fleet. Maintenance schedules had also been disrupted in previous years. Nuclear availability collapsed. France's nuclear generation fell to around 279 terawatt-hours in 2022, its lowest annual level since 1988. For the first time since 1980, France became a net electricity importer. It was an uncomfortable reminder. Standardization can be incredibly efficient when everything works. But when similar reactors develop similar problems, one technical issue can affect a large part of the fleet at the same time. Production recovered afterward. Nuclear generation rose to 320.4 terawatt-hours in 2023 and reached 373 terawatt-hours by 2025. Then there's the question that follows nuclear power everywhere. What happens to the waste? France doesn't simply remove all spent reactor fuel and immediately treat it as permanent waste. It has developed an extensive nuclear fuel cycle industry, including reprocessing at La Hague in Normandy, where uranium and plutonium can be separated from other materials in spent fuel for potential reuse. Radioactive material that cannot be reused still requires careful treatment, storage, and ultimately long-term disposal. And that gets to the central argument over nuclear power. Supporters point to the enormous quantities of reliable, low-carbon electricity produced from a relatively small physical footprint. They argue that France demonstrates nuclear energy can operate at national scale, rather than simply filling a niche. Critics point to radioactive waste, accident risk, aging reactors, construction costs, and the enormous complexity of building new plants. France itself has experienced those difficulties. Its newest reactor, Flamanville 3, uses the more advanced European pressurized reactor design, or EPR. The project suffered years of delays before eventually entering the French fleet. By February 2026, EDF reported that Flamanville 3 had reached 100% power. Instead of abandoning nuclear energy because of those problems, however, France is preparing another generation. EDF's current EPR2 program involves plans for 3 pairs of new reactors, 6 reactors altogether intended to eventually help renew France's aging nuclear fleet while working alongside renewable energy. And that's what makes France so fascinating. The country isn't choosing simply between nuclear power and renewables. Increasingly, its challenge is figuring out how both fit together. Wind and solar are expanding. Hydroelectricity remains important. Nuclear plants provide enormous amounts of low-carbon electricity. At the same time, France wants to electrify more transportation, heating, and industry so that electricity replaces oil and natural gas in other parts of the economy. That could make the electricity system even more important than it already is. So if you want to understand France, don't look only at the Eiffel Tower or the streets of Paris. Look at the cooling towers rising beside the Rhône, Loire, and other French rivers. They tell the story of a country that faced an energy crisis half a century ago and responded with one of the boldest infrastructure experiments in modern history. France didn't discover enormous domestic oil fields. It didn't become Europe's biggest coal producer. Instead, it built reactors. Dozens of them. That decision gave France one of the world's most nuclear-dependent electricity systems, helped keep its electricity unusually low carbon, and turned the country into a major electricity exporter. But it also created new challenges: aging plants, expensive construction projects, radioactive waste, and the constant requirement to maintain an enormous and highly complex technological system. France's nuclear experiment is still unfolding, and whether the next chapter proves that nuclear power can remain the backbone of a modern low-carbon economy, or shows just how difficult replacing an aging atomic fleet can become, France will probably remain one of the most important countries in the world to watch. France bet big on nuclear power, and it helped shape the country we know today. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, And join us for the next country explained through the one thing that changed everything.